finally carrying a pregnancy to term following prayer from prophetess Deborah, a banker from Port Harcourt who had spent her life savings on IVF treatments before experiencing a natural conception just weeks after attending a miracle service. What struck Grace most about these testimonials was how specific they were. The women didn't just talk about getting pregnant, they provided medical documentation, ultrasound photos, birth certificates. They shared exact dates, detailed timelines, and contact information for people who could verify their stories. This wasn't the vague, spiritual language Grace had encountered in other religious settings. These were concrete, measurable miracles with evidence to back them up. Grace also noticed that many of the testimonials mentioned dreams and visions that had preceded their pregnancies. Women talked about vivid dreams involving water, symbols of new life, and encounters with spiritual beings who assured them their time of waiting was over. Several mentioned receiving special items from prophetess Deborah, blessed oil, prayer cloths, or small mirrors that had been prayed over and were meant to be kept close during the waiting period. The church itself was described as a massive, state-of-the-art facility that could accommodate thousands of worshippers. Photos showed a modern auditorium with professional lighting and sound systems, comfortable seating, and multiple large screens that allowed everyone to see clearly regardless of where they sat. The architecture was impressive: soaring ceilings, beautiful stained glass windows, and an altar area that seemed designed to create a sense of awe and reverence. Special miracle services were held monthly, always on the first Saturday of each month, and required advance registration due to overwhelming demand. Grace read that people traveled from across West Africa and even internationally to attend these services. The church provided accommodation recommendations and travel assistance for those coming from far away, treating each service as a major event that required careful planning and preparation. The more Grace researched, the more legitimate everything appeared. She found news articles about the church's charitable work in the community, interviews with prophetess Deborah on respected religious television programs, and endorsements from other prominent religious leaders. There were photos of the prophetess meeting with government officials, participating in interfaith dialogues, and receiving awards for her humanitarian efforts. But it was the financial transparency that really impressed Grace. Unlike many religious organizations she'd encountered, the Sanctuary of the Living Mantle published detailed financial reports showing how donations were used. The majority of funds went toward maintaining the facility, supporting community outreach programs, and providing free services to those who couldn't afford to make offerings. There were no expensive cars or lavish homes visible in the leadership's lifestyle, no pressure for large financial commitments from members. Grace found herself returning to the testimonial videos again and again, studying the faces of the women who had experienced miracles. She looked for signs of deception, coached responses, or artificial emotion, but found none. These women spoke with the natural cadence of people sharing genuine experiences. They stumbled over words occasionally, paused to collect their thoughts, and displayed the kind of spontaneous emotion that was difficult to fake. One video particularly caught her attention. A woman named Jennifer, who looked to be about Grace's age, had struggled with infertility for 16 years, even longer than Grace's 14-year journey. Jennifer's story included multiple failed IVF attempts, a devastating ectopic pregnancy that had required emergency surgery, and a period of severe depression that had nearly ended her marriage. But after attending a miracle service at the Sanctuary of the Living Mantle, she had conceived naturally within 6 weeks. What made Jennifer's testimony especially compelling was her honesty about her initial skepticism. She admitted that she had only attended the service because her sister had pressured her to go, and that she had spent the first part of the service mentally criticizing what she saw as emotional manipulation. But something had changed when prophetess Deborah had looked directly at her during the altar call. Jennifer described feeling as if the prophetess could see straight into her soul, could understand the depth of her pain without any explanation. The prayer itself had been unlike anything Jennifer had experienced before. She described feeling a physical sensation, like warm oil being poured over her entire body, and a voice, not audible to others but crystal clear to her, speaking directly to her heart with words of comfort and promise. Within days, she had begun experiencing pregnancy symptoms, and a home test confirmed what she hardly dared to believe. Grace watched Jennifer's testimony multiple times, pausing to examine her facial expressions, listening carefully to her tone of voice, looking for any indication that the story might be rehearsed or exaggerated. But Jennifer spoke with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone simply sharing what had happened to her, without embellishment or dramatic flair. The baby Jennifer held in the video was clearly her biological child. They share the same distinctive nose and eye shape. The child appeared healthy and alert, reaching for the camera with the natural curiosity of a well-cared-for infant. Jennifer's husband appeared briefly in the video, corroborating the timeline and expressing his own amazement at the turn their lives had taken. As Grace continued her research, she began to notice other details that added to the church's credibility. The Sanctuary of the Living Mantle had been operating for over 15 years, with a consistent track record of community service and spiritual ministry. Prophetess Deborah had never been associated with any scandals or controversies, unlike some other prominent religious figures Grace had read about over the years. The church's approach to miracles also seemed different from what Grace had encountered elsewhere. Rather than making broad promises or guaranteeing specific outcomes, Prophetess Deborah consistently emphasized that all healing and miracles came from God, and that her role was simply to be a vessel for His power. She encouraged people to continue working with their doctors, and never suggested that faith should replace medical care entirely. Grace found interviews where Prophetess Deborah spoke about the responsibility she felt toward the people who came to her services. She talked about the importance of genuine faith, the danger of false expectations, and the need for people to understand that spiritual breakthrough often required patience and persistence. These weren't the words of someone looking to exploit desperate people, but rather someone who seemed genuinely concerned about their well-being. The logistical details of attending a service also seemed well-organized and professional. The church's website provided clear information about service times, registration procedures, and what to expect during a visit. There were detailed directions, parking information, and even suggestions for what to wear to show proper respect for the sacred nature of the gathering. Grace learned that the miracle services followed a specific format that had been refined over years of ministry. The service would begin with extended worship and praise, designed to create an atmosphere of faith and expectation. Prophetess Deborah would then deliver a message specifically focused on God's power to bring breakthrough in impossible situations, often sharing testimonies from previous services to encourage those who were still waiting for their miracles. The altar call portion of the service was described as the most powerful part of the gathering. Prophetess Deborah would invite forward those who were seeking miraculous intervention in their lives, particularly women struggling with infertility. The prayer time that followed was said to be intensely spiritual, with many people reporting physical sensations, visions, or direct spiritual encounters during these moments. What Grace found most encouraging was that the church didn't pressure people to make immediate financial commitments or purchase special prayer items. While offerings were accepted, they were presented as optional expressions of gratitude rather than requirements for receiving prayer or ministry. Several testimonials specifically mentioned that the women had received powerful prayer and ministry, even though they had been unable to make significant financial contributions. Grace spent an entire week researching, reading, and praying about whether to attend one of the miracle services. She called the church's information line and spoke with a gentle-voiced woman who answered her questions patiently and provided additional details about what to expect. The woman, who identified herself as Sister Mary, explained that Prophetess Deborah always prayed for everyone who came forward, regardless of their background or financial situation. Sister Mary also mentioned that many people experienced breakthrough not immediately during the service, but in the weeks and months following their visit. She encouraged Grace to come with an open heart and realistic expectations, emphasizing that God's timing was not always the same as human timing, but that He was always faithful to those who sought Him earnestly. By the end of the week, Grace had made her decision. The next miracle service was scheduled for the upcoming Saturday, just 5 days away. Despite some lingering uncertainty and the familiar fear of another disappointment, she felt a stronger pull toward hope than she had experienced in years. Something about Prophetess Deborah and the Sanctuary of the Living Mantle felt different from her previous attempts to find spiritual solutions to her infertility. The night before she planned to attend the service, Grace sat down with Connell for a serious conversation about her decision. She showed him all of her research, shared the testimonials that had moved her most deeply, and explained why she felt this might be different from their previous attempts to find answers through faith-based approaches. Connell listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and expressing his own observations about what Grace had discovered. He admitted that the evidence seemed more substantial than anything they had encountered before, and that the church's approach appeared more professional and less exploitative than some other religious organizations they had investigated. "I want to come with you," he said finally, surprising Grace with his decisiveness. "If you're going to do this, if this is our next step, then we do it together." Grace felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Having Connell's support meant everything, especially given how many disappointments they had already shared. She knew that his presence at the service would provide both practical and emotional support, regardless of what happened. They spent the rest of the evening making practical preparations for the trip. The Sanctuary of the Living Mantle was located about 2 hours away from their home, so they would need to leave early Saturday morning to arrive on time for the service. Grace packed a small bag with her Bible, a notebook for taking notes, and the printed testimonials that had convinced her to make the trip. As she prepared for bed that night, Grace felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness unlike anything she had experienced in years. Part of her was afraid to hope too much, afraid of another crushing disappointment that would leave her even more broken than before. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant for too long, was beginning to stir with genuine excitement about the possibility that their long season of waiting might finally be coming to an end. Saturday morning arrived with heavy clouds hanging low over a barred city, and Grace woke to the sound of rain drumming against their bedroom window. For a moment, she considered whether the weather might be a sign that she shouldn't make the trip. She'd learned over the years to look for meanings in coincidences, to search for divine guidance in the smallest details of her daily life. But as she stood at the window watching the rain, Grace felt something different stirring inside her chest. Instead of doubt, she felt a kind of determined peace that surprised her. The weather wasn't going to stop her from taking this step. If anything, the dramatic sky seemed fitting for what might be a life-changing day. Connell was already in the kitchen making coffee when Grace emerged from the bedroom, dressed in her best church outfit, a simple but elegant navy blue dress that made her feel both appropriate for a sacred service and confident in her appearance. He handed her a steaming mug without a word, understanding that she might need a few quiet minutes to collect her thoughts before they left. The drive to the Sanctuary of the Living Mantle took them through parts of the country Grace rarely visited. As they left the familiar chaos of a barred city behind, the landscape gradually shifted from urban sprawl to smaller towns and rural communities. The rain continued steadily, creating a rhythmic soundtrack for their journey and washing the world clean in a way that felt symbolic to Grace. They talked very little during the first hour of the drive, both lost in their own thoughts about what the day might bring. Grace found herself alternating between excitement and terror, sometimes within the span of a few minutes. She'd imagine walking out of the church pregnant, finally having the miracle she'd prayed for so desperately, and then immediately worry about what would happen if nothing changed, if this turned out to be just another false hope in a long series of disappointments. Connell seemed to sense her internal struggle without her having to voice it. About halfway through the journey, he reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently in a gesture that communicated everything he couldn't put into words. They were in this together, whatever happened. That knowledge alone gave Grace strength to face whatever lay ahead. As they got closer to their destination, they began encountering other travelers who were clearly heading to the same place. Cars with license plates from distant states, groups of women traveling together, families who looked like they were dressed for an important occasion. Grace found herself studying the faces of other passengers when they stopped at traffic lights, wondering about their stories, what desperate hopes had brought them to seek out Prophetess Deborah's ministry. The Sanctuary of the Living Mantle was even more impressive in person than it had appeared in photographs. The building rose from the landscape like a modern cathedral, its glass and steel architecture somehow managing to convey both contemporary sophistication and timeless spiritual significance. The parking lot was massive, already nearly full despite the early hour, with uniformed attendants directing traffic and helping visitors find spaces. Grace and Connell joined the stream of people walking toward the main entrance, everyone moving with the purposeful energy of individuals who had traveled far and sacrificed much to be there. The diversity of the crowd was striking. People of all ages, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, representing various ethnic groups and speaking multiple languages.